Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next games are versus Gradius and Gradius for the Play Choice 10. Similar to last week, we've got another Konami game that released on both the Versus system and the Play Choice 10. While Konami completely handled the publishing of the NES version, both the Versus system and the Play Choice 10 versions were advertised and distributed by Nintendo themselves, as we can see on the flyers for the games. Now, something interesting about this one was that the NES version was already based on an arcade game made by Konami, which was called Nemesis in the West. So yes, Gradius was made for the arcades, then was ported to consoles, and then was ported back to the arcades twice. To my surprise, this is actually true for a lot of the third-party games on the Play Choice 10. At first, I didn't really understand why third parties would agree to this, since it seems like this would just make the Play Choice 10 games compete with the original machines. My best guess is that third parties like Konami must have figured that the ease of installing onto an already existing machine would make the game more enticing to arcade owners who weren't going to purchase the original cabinet anyway. So, what's the history of Gradius itself? Well, Gradius is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, and it wasn't even Konami's first game like this. Now, if you watched my video on Pac-Man, you'll remember that I said that Pac-Man is often considered a turning point for the industry, where arcade games shifted from space shooters to more character-led games. However, that doesn't mean space shooters suddenly stopped existing. One of Konami's first major successes was a side-scrolling space shooter called Scramble, released in 1981, not too long after Pac-Man. Kagemasa Kozuki, one of Konami's founders, described Scramble as one of Konami's most important games, since it was the game that launched them into world prominence. Fast forward a few years later, and a man named Hiroyasu Machiguchi joined Konami and was tasked with creating a game. Apparently, Machiguchi hardly even knew anything about gaming, so he sought the advice of his colleagues at Konami on what kind of game to make, and they all told him to make a shoot-'em-up. Around this time, Namco had recently released Xevious, a vertical-scrolling shoot-'em-up that saw a lot of success, and Machiguchi has said that one of their goals was to surpass it. Gradius was built on the foundations of Scramble, and it was even initially known as Scramble 2 internally. Machiguchi said that the development period of the game was full of anxiety because he and his team didn't have a whole lot of confidence in what they were doing. Apparently, Machiguchi even gave a pretty poor presentation when he pitched the final game to the higher-ups in Konami, and the project was barely even greenlit. One complaint the sales team had was that they thought that each level felt too different, since most games at the time only featured a single scenario. What a funny complaint looking back on it retroactively. Anyway, despite the uncertainty, the game would go on to be a pretty big hit, and I often see Gradius cited as one of the most influential games in the shoot-'em-up genre. Of course, like many successful arcade games at the time, this one received a port to the Famicom. It was developed for around 6 months by a group of 4 people. According to Kazuhisa Hashimoto, one of the developers, the Famicom version performed below expectations in Japan, as they manufactured around 1 million copies but only sold around 500 to 600,000 of them. However, the cover of the NES version says that Gradius sold 1 million in Japan, so I'm not really sure what the full story is here. Maybe the Western release just used the numbers they shipped to stores, since that lines up with the 1 million number provided by Hashimoto. Something you might already know about this game was that the NES port was actually the very first game to use the famous Konami code, and according to Hashimoto, he put the code in the game because it was too difficult for him to beat the game without it. Well, I can't find much more information as to why they decided to put this game back to the arcades on the Versus system and the Play Choice 10, so with all of that out of the way, let's jump into my time with the games. Similar to the Goonies, I once again started with the Versus system version. Thankfully, unlike that one, I don't think the Versus system port was made harder or anything. Honestly, I'm not even sure what was all that different, other than the fact that it had a dedicated continue option when you got a game over. The story of this game is that the peaceful Earth-like world, called Gradius, is under attack from an alien race known as the Bacterions. You play as a pilot controlling a ship called the Warp Rattler, and your objective is to destroy the enemy fortress, Xarius. Apparently, the ship has been called a few different names in different games and regions, but its official name is actually the Vic Viper, and that's what most people seem to know it as. Anyway, I guess their explanation for the variance of each of the individual levels is that you have to steal enemy power capsules along your route to boost your ship's hyperpowers or something. You start in the middle of space with a bunch of enemy aircraft flying at you, while some catchy music is playing in the background. There's quite a variety of enemy types here, with enemies that just fly around, enemies that shoot at you, and even these guys that bounce around on the ground. It's not too uncommon for the screen to get covered in bullets and enemies. For the time, the big thing that stands out in this game though is the power-up system. Occasionally, you'll see orange enemies, and these guys will drop power capsules. Additionally, you can also get power capsules from destroying every enemy in certain groups, too. Each power capsule you collect will highlight one of the power-ups on the bottom, starting from the left. Then, you can press a button to activate whatever power-up is currently selected. Basically, because of how this works, you'll need to collect more of these drops to get a power-up the further it is to the right. The first of these power-ups is a speed-up, which is pretty self-explanatory, and you can get multiple of these that will stack on top of each other. The missile upgrade gives you another attack that drops missiles in a diagonal direction. This is useful because of the way it increases your range, and they ride along the ground, which is nice too. The double power-up is sort of like the missiles, but it sends an attack upwards instead. These things are just normal attacks though, and don't travel along the surface like the missiles do. The lasers are an upgrade to your standard attacks that make them larger, and they keep traveling across the screen even when they destroy an enemy. This power-up is pretty useful for clearing out a lot of enemies at once. However, you can't have this power-up and the double power-up at the same time for some reason, so you have to choose which of them you like more. Generally, I like the lasers more, but the double power-up was definitely more useful in certain levels, especially in ones where there were a lot of enemies on the ceiling. The option power-up gives you a doppelganger called a Sidewinder. These things will copy your movements and fire whenever you do, effectively doubling your firing output. You can make 2 of these in total. The final power-up, just labeled as a question mark, is a barrier that makes you completely invulnerable to enemy attacks. It kind of looks like it only protects the spot in front of you, but it actually completely protects you from anything. It can only take a certain amount of hits though, so effectively it just works as an added health bar. This one is really good since normally you blow up in a single hit. I guess that's why they make it the hardest one to get though. All in all, it's a pretty cool system that lets you prioritize which upgrades you want to get first. However, you lose it all in a single death, and since it requires so many power capsules to fill out, it can feel pretty tough to get things going again after a single death. In addition to these power capsules, every now and then an enemy will drop a blue power-up that essentially just wipes out everything on the screen. The first level starts with the standard space section, but eventually I ended up in an area with mountains and trees on the top and bottom of the screen. This section was a lot more crowded, and I completely blew up after a guy spawned right on top of me while I was getting a power capsule. Eventually, I reached a section with these 2 mountains on the bottom. It looked like the screen scroll stopped and a new song started playing, but boulders started flying out of the mountains out of nowhere and I blew up almost immediately. Yeah, I don't think I had enough time to react to that one. I decided to move up to the top next time in preparation for the boulders, and I survived for a little longer, but man, these things come in so fast. Finally, on my next attempt, I found a safe spot, but yeesh, they were still flying pretty close to me. After some time, the mountain stopped shooting boulders at me and I kept moving, although for some reason, the boss music was still playing. Eventually, I ran into this big ship that just moved up and down and shot a bunch of lasers at me. At first, I wasn't even sure I was hitting him, since the sound it makes when you hit him kind of sounds like something hitting a shield. It turns out I was hitting him though, and it didn't take too long for me to take him down. After beating him, I moved on to level 2. Similar to the last one, this level started with a brief open space section, but soon I entered an area with a bunch of rock formations with these pink blocks that can be destroyed. This part wasn't too bad, although it definitely felt pretty cramped at times. Once I got far enough, the boss music started playing again, but instead of a bunch of flying rocks, a bunch of these sphere enemies spawned in over and over again. Despite some really close calls, I somehow got through it on my first try. After this, another one of those big ships appeared, and it was time for another fight. This guy really isn't all that bad though, and I beat him with ease. I guess that's the level structure of this game. A brief space section at the beginning, unique structures for the main stage, then a 2-part boss with a dodging section followed by one of those big ships. Level 3 saw a massive spike in difficulty. The main part of this stage was covered in these moai heads that shoot attacks at you, and man, this part was absolutely brutal. There's just so much to dodge in this one, and not a whole lot of space to move. I died over and over to this level. You can actually destroy the moai heads, but without any power-ups it was kind of tough to do. After a couple of game overs, I did finally get past it, although that boss music started playing and I did not want to die and do that again. This level sent a bunch of these big guys at you that track your movements and shoot these circle things at you in groups of 3. You can destroy these guys, but I was too weak at this point to defeat them quick enough. I had some super close calls, but thankfully I got past this section and moved on to the big ship. Fortunately, these guys are easy and I beat him. Phew, I don't have to do that stage again. The next level was really similar to the first stage. It had another section with mountains and trees, although this time the volcano section had the mountains on the top. The enemy formations made this one a bit tougher than the first level, but it didn't take me too long to get through it and move on to the next stage. Definitely a lot easier than the last one. Stage 5 didn't have any actual physical stage design, and instead it just threw a bunch of these big meatball guys at you that tried to grab you with tentacles. Once again, you can destroy these enemies, but I had been dying enough that I was pretty weak. The meatball guys lagged the game up like crazy too, although frankly, this kinda made them easier to dodge. Once the boss music started playing, the dodging section this time around was even more of those meatball guys. I guess this time at least they threw one at you that didn't have any arms, but honestly, it kind of just felt like a continuation of the main stage. After this, I beat another one of those big ships and moved on. Once again, this level was so much easier than Stage 3. However, they decided to crank up the difficulty again for Stage 6. This one was covered in these weird vine things you had to destroy, and there were a ton of these amoeba enemies that took a lot of hits to defeat. I think these might be the Bacterions themselves, since the manual describes them as amoeboids. Man, without any upgrades, it did not feel like I had nearly enough firepower to make it through this stage. Some of the amoeba guys had power-ups, but I was never able to kill them in time, so instead I just tried to develop some exact strats that let me barely dodge everyone. It took forever, but I finally made it to the boss. Yeesh, that was brutal so far. At least the bosses haven't been all that tough, right? Unfortunately, they completely change up the formula here and throw a totally new boss at you, and he's kind of insane. He just throws a gazillion bullets at you at all times, and no matter what I did, I just couldn't find anywhere even remotely safe against this guy. Eventually, I broke down and decided to practice him using save states to see if I could find anything that would work against him. Since I still like to complete these games without save states though, that would effectively make this run dead, and I would want to start over from the beginning for a real run. To my dismay, while I was trying to figure out the save state controls, I accidentally quit out of the game, so I had to do it all over again. Just to save state practice. Great. I guess that's what I get for trying to be a cheater. Well, since I was already going to save state practice anyway, I used them to get through this run and I got back to the boss pretty quickly. However, right before I went to fight him, one of my viewers made a random comment about the button mashing in this game, and I realized something terrible. This whole time, I was holding down the attack button when mashing the attack button was way faster. Like, it's not even close. Remember how I said I couldn't defeat those amoeba guys fast enough? It was a total cakewalk with mashing. I could not believe how much I was sabotaging myself with this game. With that, I found a relatively safe strat for the boss where I placed myself in the right spot and just mashed. After feeling comfortable enough with him, I decided to reset the game and try again from the start. Man though, mashing made such a huge difference. I was able to maintain a powered up state for so much longer, and I was able to get the shields a bunch. I survived so much more, and I even got through the Moai section with almost no trouble. Sadly, I did take an unfortunate death in the meatball stage, which meant I wasn't fully powered up for the one I'd been stuck on. Thankfully though, there's enough of those orange amoeba guys here that it didn't take me all that long to beat the boss. After this was the final level, Stage 7. This one has you flying into the fortress, and man, this stage is so cramped. Despite my newfound mashing power, I still kind of got wrecked by this stage. It was just really hard to build up a reasonable amount of power-ups, and there's just bad guys and bullets flying everywhere. Finally though, I reached the most difficult obstacle in the game, a door. This thing closed right in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to get past it, and I got squished. This actually confused me a ton at first. How was I supposed to get past this thing? It turns out you just have to get through it before it closes. There's not a whole lot of room though, so you've got to be quick. Once I finally got past it, it was time for the final boss, some sort of brain thing attached to the fortress through these waves of electricity. This thing was a total joke. It doesn't do anything, and you just blast it until you are suddenly taken to a cutscene of the fortress blowing up. I guess it's supposed to be more of a victory lap for making it this far. Honestly, the boss of the last stage felt more like the final boss. Heck, even that blue door was more of a challenge than this. With that, the game congratulated me and sent me back to the beginning. Versus Gradius complete. Now it's time to do it all over, but on the Play Choice 10 this time. Oh boy, here we go again. As usual, I read the Play Choice 10 info page for this one, and to my surprise, it completely shares the Konami code with you. I don't typically like using cheat codes that aren't provided by the manual, although admittedly I've already made a few exceptions to this that we'll see in some upcoming videos, but now that I've seen the Konami code within the Play Choice 10, I think it's fair game at this point. Besides, I've already beaten the game in its entirety, so using the code will help make this next run a bit different anyway. Using this code doesn't quite give you full power-ups, but it's close. It gives you missiles, 2 of those doppelganger things, and a full shield. The only thing you have to build yourself is the speed and whichever of the double or laser power-ups you want. I'm not entirely sure how often you can use it, but I noticed that you could at least refresh it whenever you got to a new level, so I basically never ran out of shields with this. After everything I had already been through, the game was a total breeze with the Konami code. I blasted through it without losing a single life and beat it in under 20 minutes. With that, Gradius for the Play Choice 10 was complete. On to the reviews. Well, here comes the part of the video where I once again tell everyone that the genre for the game I just played is one that I'm not all that into. I definitely like shmups more than some of the other genres I've talked about, like high score chasers and sports games, but I've personally never been able to get all that into them. This kind of surprises me a bit too, since typically I like challenging games, so part of me thinks shmups should be more up my alley. However, I'm not going to sit here and try to convince myself I should like something more than I actually do. I know it probably seems like I can be pretty picky about games at times, but we've all got different genres we like more than others, and I think the nature of this challenge will inevitably shine a spotlight on which ones I like less than others. As for Gradius itself, I thought the game was enjoyable enough, although it didn't knock my socks off like I imagined it did for many at the time. It can get pretty hectic, but that's all part of the fun, trying to manage all the on-screen threats at once. I like the idea behind the power-up system giving you multiple options, but sometimes the amount of power capsules needed for certain upgrades felt like a bit much, especially right after a death. At least the game gives you quite a bit of the power capsules, but there were definitely certain sections where it was really rough to build up again after losing a life. I like that the game has a bunch of unique levels, which is a huge step up from the fixed space shooters I've played so far, but I also feel like the level difficulty is a bit inconsistent. Level 3 was so brutal, but then they suddenly switched back to another mountain stage, followed by the relatively bland meatball stage, which felt a bit all over the place. The reuse of the same boss was a bit disappointing too, but I guess all in all, this was still quite a bit of variety for the time. It's a pretty fun game, but there's just a few things that hold it back for me. I gave both versions of Gradius a 7 out of 10. With Versus Gradius and Gradius for the Play Choice 10 complete, I have now finished 47 out of the 74 arcade games in the challenge, meaning I am now 63% of the way through all of the arcade games. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.